Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Alan Roberson with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, and I'm going to be moderator for your webcast this afternoon. Today we're going to try and present some useful information on linking source water protection and emergency preparedness and response. This is part of the Source Water Collaborative Learning and Exchange webinar series. Can I have the next slide? So before we get started on the meat and potatoes of the webinar, I want to give a little background about the Source Water Collaborative. It's 27 national organizations, and I serve as the co-chair of this group. And I like this collaborative because it represents a broad range of perspectives in the drinking water community. So we have your traditional water associations like the American Water Works Association, but then we have a lot of more environmentally based groups, American Rivers, Clean Water Action, Clean Water Fund, as well as several government agencies. So I think it makes a nice blend of the different perspectives as we try and move forward on the challenging issues we have with source water protection. Next slide. So as part of the efforts of the collaborative, we've developed this learning exchange. And the goal of the exchange is to provide a platform to share experiences, transfer knowledge, and learn about funding and technical resources for source water protection. And we do that a lot of different ways. We publish success stories on the website. We have webinars like today and other events. We have specialists that work on communications and posting news on social media. And then again on the website, resources and tips. So can I have the next slide? So last year in 2017, as you can see, there were 5 different webinars covering a variety of themes. Again, the one that you're listening to today is focusing on emergency response preparedness. And we've got one planned in the fall that will look at agriculture and land conservation. Next slide. So again, today's themes is to think about how to link source water protection and emergency preparedness and response. And we hope that we'll be able to provide some tips on this based on lessons learned from a recent spill in the Potomac River in the DC area. Next slide. So today we have 3 presenters. Myself, again, I'm Alan Roberson. I'm Executive Director of the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. I'm relatively new here. I started in January. I had a previous career in water with 25 years at the American Water Works Association. And then we're going to have a tag team between Greg Prelowitz from Fairfax Water and Steve Bieber from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. So Greg and Steve were in that core group of people with boots on the ground about the Potomac River spill. And so they'll be able to give you a lot of the details, a lot more details than I could. I'm familiar with what happened, given the fact that I live and work in Washington, D.C. And in the interest of self-disclosure, I want to state that I'm also on the board of directors of Fairfax Water, and we were briefed about this at one of our recent board meetings. So next slide, sort of a couple of logistical items before we move forward with the content. We're going to have all 3 of us available to answer questions. So please type your questions into the box on your webinar control panel. We're not taking verbal questions today. You may type in your questions at any time during the webinar. So it's not just at the end, but if you have any, we'll address all the questions at the end after the presenters are finished speaking. And then if you want the question to be answered by a specific panelist, myself or Greg or Steve, then include the panelist name in your question. I'll read back the questions before we go through the answers. Next slide. So then after the webinar, please note that the presentation and the recording of today's webinar will be made available on the Source Water Collaborative website within the next week, and it gives you the URL. And again, that's a pretty useful tool. I would recommend that you try and go to that website on a regular basis to check out the different resources and tools. So if we can have the next slide, please. So I wanted to put in a few slides to give my perspective on the threats to water and then preparedness and response. And so as you can see on this, you can have a lot of things that can cause denial of service. You can have physical destruction from extreme weather events, natural disasters, mechanical breakdowns, human errors, accidents, mistakes. You may have contamination, which may or may not be readily apparent. And then in the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen a growing concern about cyber hacking because it's different than some of these other threats where you kind of have to be near the facility or adjacent facility. You don't have to be nearby to create a problem in cyber hacking. And the challenge that water systems have is trying to understand what's the greatest threat. We really don't know. There's limited knowledge as to how often these events might occur. We're dealing with very low frequency, high probability events. The term that I've heard used before is the black swan. And so again, you don't have the ability to sort through these different threats, prioritize them, to know how to prioritize your investment in emergency preparedness and response. So can we have the next slide? So again, you know, as a board member at a water system, the question I'm always thinking about is what's the appropriate funding balance between, you know, being prepared and investing in technologies or, you know, guns and guards versus being able to respond and recover. And again, we're still unsure of the largest threat. Water systems are always very distributed. You can't protect all the assets. And again, you know, if you want to have a response approach for all hazard, this approach takes resources, both people's time and then investing in their time and maybe investing in additional technologies, emergency generators, or even just taking the time off to participate in a tabletop exercise. So the big question is, how do you prioritize preparedness? And I hope some of the content we present today will help answer that question. Next slide, please. So, and then just a couple slides here that just again to give you some idea of the range of threats that water systems face. I kind of put them into 2 categories. You see a list here of natural threats ranging from tornadoes to algal toxins. Wildfires depends on how it starts. It may be you know, a campfire that you can distinguish properly, or it could be a lightning strike. So it kind of depends. I think they're more of a natural threat. But again, it depends. And similar with waterborne disease outbreaks, those can be naturally occurring. They can also be a man-made threat from, let's say, a sanitary sewer overflow or some kind of wastewater treatment plant malfunction. Next slide, please. So, and then the second category is the man-made threats. And again, what we're focusing on a little bit today are the spill from chemical storage and transportation. And we'll go into more detail. And again, you can see the human error and the range of terrorism. So go to the next slide. I just want to tee up Greg and Steve for their presentation. They're going to go into some detail about what happened at the Potomac River late last year. So take it away, Steve and Greg.
Thank you very much. This is Greg. Just so you know, Steve and I are participating in the same room here. So when you see us on the webcast, you'll see Greg and Steve talking. You may just have to distinguish between our voices and know which one is speaking. But we're pleased to be here to share what happened, how we can learn from this. This event was not the first spill that occurred in the Potomac Basin. It probably won't be the last, but we need to have a mindset of continuous improvement to help keep our water safe and protected. Okay, here's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. We're going to set the stage about the first 5 or 10 minutes, providing background on the regional water supply, including the Potomac River. We'll define some of the acronyms and agencies and entities in the Potomac Basin, so you have familiarity about what we're speaking about. We'll go through a detailed timeline and the utility response, some of the challenges and critical outcomes that we realized after the fact. Got an opportunity to conduct an after-action conference and report, and we're going to share some of that information. Finally, we've got some lessons learned from other events and how we can integrate what we've learned into ongoing source water protection activities. We'll have plenty of time at the end for some questions and answers. Next slide, please. Okay, so just by way of background, some folks I know, I see familiar names on the webinar, familiar with COG, others not. But we're, as an organization, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, a voluntary regional organization in Washington, D.C., of local governments. Folks that might be familiar with what a metropolitan planning organization is, that's what we are for the Metro Washington region. Most of what we do as an organization is regional transportation planning, but we have a pretty big environmental department that does everything from air quality, energy, and climate to water, wastewater planning, and a lot of field work related to that too. I won't read the rest there, but you see the link to our website, and certainly you can check out sort of what COG's about if you're interested after the webinar. So you can jump to the next slide, please. And this is just for frame of reference, a locator map of where the COG region is. So you can see bordered by Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, Maryland, and so forth. And for frame of reference, you see the arrow there. I apologize, I can't control the cursor, but where it says Chesapeake Bay. For those not familiar with our region, just below that's the Potomac River, which is what we're going to be talking about. And the non-tidal part of the river starts right about where our COG logo is in the middle of the blue area there. So we're going to be talking about the Potomac River from kind of that point and upstream from there. So next slide, please. So just a little bit about our water security program in the National Capital Region. We've had in place now for decades a regional water supply emergency plan, and the region has a regional emergency coordination plan that lays out concepts of coordination and communication for responding to all sorts of events. The water supply plan is an annex that talks to how we respond to water emergencies. Following 9/11, our water utilities, water wastewater utilities, were actually the first emergency support function to meet and begin talking about how our emergency plans needed to be changed to become all hazards plans and address things that maybe weren't anticipated years before 9/11. And as time has gone on, obviously we've added additional components to the work we do as a region to include early warning monitoring on the Potomac and in the distribution systems of some of our utilities. NCR Warn, utility folks will be familiar with that. For those that aren't utility folks, it's basically a mutual aid, utility helping utility program similar to what you see in the electric industry. So when we have an event like a spill or any other type of an event, we have mechanisms in place for utilities to assist each other and provide aid right away. All of this, like I say, builds on decades. We've been around since 1957, a regional collaboration on water supply planning for things like drought and adequate supply and so forth, and also emergency response. So please go ahead to the next slide. So I wanted to say a little bit about regional communication and coordination. Probably any emergency event, if you were to look at the AAR from it, you'll hear a comment about communications as being a problem. We focus a lot on that in the National Capital Region for all kinds of events. Probably the most practiced part of regional communication we do is our snow emergency plan and regional calls around responding to snow events during the winter months, because that's a predictable thing every year. But you see here a couple of tools we have that help to make sure we have good communication and coordination. One is a first hour checklist. It applies to all kinds of events, not just water events. We've modified it a little bit to be water specific, but what it essentially does is give you an organized way to gain regional situational awareness, determine what the response status is, review the status of any protective actions that have been taken already, any kind of public notification that's gone out,
consider if additional protective actions might be needed depending on the event, evaluate what your public information needs might be, and then determine next steps. So we sort of have an organized way of doing all of that. In addition to that, specific to spill events like the one we had on the Potomac, there's an organization, you see the acronym there, ICPRB, which is the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. Our utilities are members of that organization, as are the states, and they serve a lot of functions related to source water protection. Specific to this event, they also do spill modeling and spill notification for all the utilities on the Potomac. So when a spill is reported to the National Response Center, ICPRB gets that notification, and they can push out an alert to the utilities very quickly, which is what happened in this case. The other tool you see listed there is our Regional Incident Communication and Coordination System. That's an alerting system through Everbridge, if you're familiar with that, but it allows us to reach our utilities and other officials via phone, text message, pager, email, simultaneously if there's a regional event occurring, so we can alert them what actions to take or where to get more information. And then last, I mentioned WARN. Related to that, we have a mutual aid agreement and an operational plan that spells out during an event how we go about providing aid to each other and requesting aid and so forth. One thing I did want to make clear in all of this, and particularly to utility communications, is that, you know, in an event like this where we're helping to organize and coordinate regional response, all local entities, including utilities, retain their prerogative of self-determination in selecting, you know, what an appropriate response measure is to an emergency that they would like to take. Our feeling, of course, is that, you know, having regional cooperation and coordination will result overall in a better response, but it's purely voluntary and it does not in any way take the place of the individual emergency response plans that utilities or other organizations have. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear. So please go ahead to the next slide.
Thanks, Steve. Located in Northern Virginia, Fairfax Water is one of the 3 major drinking water suppliers in the Washington metropolitan region. The largest water utility in Virginia serves about 1 out of every 4 Virginians on public water through retail or wholesale service. We are singularly focused on water. We have 2 state-of-the-art water production facilities sourced from 2 independent water supplies, which are capable of about 345 million gallons per day, along with a 3rd source from the Washington Aqueduct of 30 million gallons per day for a total capacity of 375 million gallons per day. Our sources of supply are the Potomac River and the Occoquan Reservoir. With around 4,000 miles of water main, we have a highly developed and integrated transmission and distribution system, greatly enhancing the reliability of the overall system by giving us numerous operating modes. Next slide, please. A little bit about the Drinking Water Partnership, the Potomac River Drinking Water Source Protection Partnership, or DWISP, or we can just call it Partnership, as more simplified. Essentially, this is kind of like the Source Water Collaborative for the region. It is a group organized, formally formed back in 2004, a voluntary association of water suppliers and government agencies that have a responsibility for drinking water supply. The administrative support for the partnership is provided by the ICPRB, or Interstate Commission on Potomac River Basin. Goals of the partnership, including identifying regional priorities for source water protection, coordinating efforts to benefit multiple water systems, establishing coordinated dialogue between suppliers and government agencies, promoting information sharing, coordinating new approaches to protection measures, and developing new initiatives. As Steve mentioned, for many years, the ICPRB has maintained a spill release model, and it's been run for dozens of different events since the late 1980s. And in fact, we have had opportunities to test the procedures, and we've had 4 different spill exercises over the past 8 or 9 years. Next slide, please. The partnership has a nice website. You can learn more about the partnership at the website listed there. Next slide, please. Oh, in fact, we may have many members of the partnership that are on board. We've got utilities from Virginia, Maryland, the District of Columbia, West Virginia, who may be on the phone as well here today. Fairfax Water, together with the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission in Maryland and the United States Army Corps of Engineers Washington Aqueduct, provide essential water service to between 4 and 5 million residents of the region, tens of thousands of businesses, and hundreds of government facilities. And the Potomac is the primary source of water supply for the region. Other entities using the Potomac River in the region include the town of Leesburg, Virginia, the city of Rockville, Maryland, and Frederick County, Maryland, who all have intakes on the Potomac. And as the Potomac forms the boundary between Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, each of the utilities has transmission and distribution systems, but has generally been developed somewhat independently with only relatively small interconnections between adjacent systems. So there's not necessarily an ability to transfer large amounts of water between utilities. Next slide, please. Well, this is the AWWA slogan. You can replace coffee with your beverage of your choice, but no Potomac, no coffee. This can help shape, this slide here can help shape the message in the minds of elected officials and other decision makers about the importance of the Potomac River to the region. It's simply more than just a drinking fountain down the hall. It's really, and you can see by the statistics there on the bottom, the economic lifeblood of the region. It's estimated based on a regional study we had done here through COG that 3 days of service disruption to the water community, to the water service, could have over $1 billion of economic impact. Next slide, please. Through cooperative agreements, Fairfax Water, WSSC, and the Washington Aqueduct, the major suppliers, have access to upstream reservoirs that provides water supply during periods of drought. Also, the the Patuxent and Occoquan reservoirs in Maryland and Virginia, respectively, can be used as off-Potomac reservoirs. And there's some historic agreements through the ICPRB, namely the Water Supply Coordination Agreement of 1982, that helps allocate supply amongst both the Potomac and the off-Potomac reservoirs. And the ICPRB, if you go to their website as well, has an opportunity, has information about the planning efforts that have gone on throughout time. Every 5 years, there's a major water supply study. And through this regional planning, the region is well prepared for in the event of a drought and is looking at long-term supply options for generations to come. Next slide, please. Collectively, the region has about an average demand, almost 500 million gallons per day, with almost 15,000 miles of water mains, and close in 5 million people or so served. So a big region, heavily reliant on the Potomac. Next slide, please. What we're going to be talking about here today is an incident related to the oil sheen from the NRG Dickerson plant. All of the intakes that I've described here in the regional system are generally located between the NRG facility and Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Steve to go through some of the details of this particular event.
Great. So I thought it'd be helpful to sort of quickly and somewhat of a high level walk through a timeline of what exactly happened, and then we'll have some sort of lessons learned at the end. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side here is a picture of the NRG generating facility at Dickerson. You can see, hopefully, on your screen a red dot. The red dot is both the discharge channel for the cooling water from the energy generating station. It's also a whitewater training facility for kayakers who do like Olympic kayaking, whitewater kayaking. But that was also, it turns out, the source of the sheen that we're going to be talking about today. So just to give you a sense of where it was coming from. So you can see there the timeline, 8:45 in the morning, of course, on a Sunday. The ferry operator there at White's Ferry reported a sheen on the river to NRG. NRG fairly quickly, after assessing their own facility and not seeing any obvious source of oil there, contacted the National Spill Response Center reporting that the spill source was unknown. And then you see by noon, the Interstate Commission had notified utilities and state agencies that there is a spill on the Potomac. And shortly after that, the town of Leesburg, their water treatment plant manager, actually went out to the Dickerson facility, White's Ferry, and so forth, to do an initial assessment of the sheen present on the river. We're able to see some sheen on the Maryland side of the river, not on the Virginia side yet. And then you can see there the travel time estimate. So, you know, it was unclear when the spill started, but assuming that, you know, based on the data we had, that it was at least around 9 or earlier, ICPRB ran their spill model, estimated the travel time to reach Leesburg at around 8 hours. So, and Fairfax Water, the ETA, would have been around 6 or 7 in the morning. So you can see there's not a whole lot of time between this initial report and utilities needing to take some action. So next slide, please. So Monday was a busy day. We had sheen detected onshore at Fairfax Water and at Leesburg. A lot of the utilities were implementing their emergency response plans and beginning to shut down their intakes as a precaution. You can see there that EPA stood up unified command with the federal and state agencies participating in that. So in Maryland, that would be Maryland Department of the Environment. Virginia, their Department of Health is their primacy agency, the District Department of the Environment, and EPA. There was a flyover that morning of the river to see what the extent of the sheen was. The picture you see at the bottom there shows you some of the sheen on the Virginia side of the river. Fairly close to the Fairfax Water intake is where that photo is. The call-out box, as you see on the map, is just a track of the flyover and where some of the photos were taken. So there was no apparent trailing edge at this point, and it was viewed as kind of something that would probably be transient, but nevertheless, utilities started putting out their own boom and made requests for additional boom from EPA, and we had our first water utility coordination call to talk about response to the event, and then you see issued a press release, both WSSC and COG, to talk about some, you know, that there is a spill, since it was a fairly obvious thing and people were going to see it, and to make folks aware of what kinds of protective actions utilities were taking and what the status of the water supply was. So next slide, please. So I'll run through kind of day by day. You see this kind of lumps a few days together what was happening. But Tuesday, the weather was terrible, so no overflights were possible. Our utilities, Washington Aqueduct, had started to do some treatability analysis to see whether or not the unknown material in the sheen was treatable, and determined it was not, which was an important point of information for our utilities. The utilities, Leesburg, Loudon Water, and others, continued to do shoreline surveys and reported seeing sheen around their intakes and on the shoreline. We did, of course, more regional calls, I believe one in the morning, one in the afternoon. EPA began to mobilize hard boom for our utilities, and we started to talk about priorities, which utilities would go first and so forth, to have an organized way of rolling that out. We also, as you see there, EPA mobilized their mobile lab and a command post that was set up in Montgomery County to have an on-site presence to coordinate response to the Sheen event. And you can see there on the left, the picture, that's the outfall from NRG. They deployed some boom there at the end, which was, a good idea, but quite frankly, I think relatively speaking, ineffective at trapping the Sheen, because the velocity of the water coming out of there can be pretty high. All the utilities were doing monitoring to ensure, water safety at their intakes, at least those that were not shut down. I'll give you a few other things. Wednesday, November 30th, the Coast Guard collected some samples, got those off to their lab. The Sheen at that point appeared to be decreasing, and just a minute, I'm just trying to, and we had our first incident action plan to kind of spell out what the unified command was doing. The EPA, Coast Guard, and others, MDE, continued to look and evaluate for possible sources. At that point, it had not been determined yet that NRG was in fact the source. The source was unknown. Later in the week, by December 2nd and 3rd, the Sheen was no longer visible at Fairfax Water or Leesburg's intakes, and actually water sampling there on December 3rd showed no presence of semi-volatiles in the water. And around the same time, NRG had agreed to stop energy production on the chance that they might be the source, even though they had not been able to determine they were. So it looked like we might have some good news. Things might be clearing up. But as you go to the next slide, we'll see that didn't turn out to be the case, unfortunately. So you see there more sheening. So here we are, basically a week into it, and we thought the Sheen had gone away, but it starts appearing again, in some cases even worse than it was before. So another flyover was done to look at the extent of that, and the U.S. Coast Guard lab had collected, like I said, samples the week before. They were able to fingerprint on Monday that in fact the Sheen substance was turbine oil from the Dickerson generating plant, and at that point NRG accepted responsibility for the spill and joined as a member of the Unified Command. At that point you can see some additional protective actions that were taken, including some additional boom at the outfall, shutting down the generating station, and continued calls by our utilities and monitoring to make sure the water supply was safe. You can go on to the next slide, please.
So I'm going to comment on this on behalf of Fairfax Water's lab, who put together a very nice slide here. On December the 5th, water utilities were provided with a sample of the turbine oil from the ERG facility. What's shown on the graph is an after-the-fact gas chromatograph plot from Fairfax Water's GCMS for the turbine oil. The graph is overlaid with samples of the oil sheen as collected at the Leesburg intake on November the 29th and at the sheen collected at Fairfax Water's intake at the time at which we decided to shut down on November the 28th. So again, this plot is an overlay of samples taken at different times. The blue sample was taken first, the red next, and finally the turbine oil that was provided is last. However, you can see that the fingerprints line up. The chromatograph shows a mixture of hydrocarbons, in this case C18 through C40 carbon chains were detected. Next slide, please.
Great. So once the source of the spill was identified, and we were confident that we were able to get into place measures to prevent any further discharge of sheen into the river, you can see here some of the things that started to happen. NRG brought on their own oil spill response organization, so basically contractors to help with shoreline cleanup, maintaining the boom. You see a picture of there. Some of the foaming that was occurring to clean that up and recover that. Debris, other things like that had become oil covered along the river. Monitoring to ensure safety of the water intakes, of course, continued. We continued our daily coordination conference calls because we kept seeing incidents similar to what you're seeing on the screen here periodically at the water intakes, and it took a while for that to go away. By around December 9th, EPA began to demobilize some of their assets, so the mobile command post, their mobile lab, and they turned over the boom and some of the other things like that you see here to the utilities, and NRG's contractor continued to maintain those until we no longer saw evidence of oil or mousse like what you see here on the picture. And we finally decided by around December 21st that the response was complete. The boom was all taken out. There was no more sheening or oil. And we could declare kind of the end of the event. Next slide, please.
So in terms of the utility perspective, the spill notification procedures generally worked well. So we've talked about the ICPRB notification, the time of travel model, the notification that came through EPA's National Response Center. We were generally provided timely notification of the event. The utility emergency response conference calls that are coordinated through COG happen quickly and were on at a frequency that as needed based on what folks were seeing on the ground and as conditions dictated in the river. And the monitoring information from the regional monitoring network was able to provide real-time, timely information. Next slide, please. Some of the challenges identified by water utilities. There may have been a lack of understanding for how the presence of the sheen can require us to shut down an intake, what this means in terms of consequences. It was an oil sheen. It was not necessarily a free product per se. And so communicating the importance of what this means to us and having to shut down intakes may have been a challenge. The utilities did not have a direct link in the unified command structure. This from our perspective, was a challenge. And because the utilities did not have a direct voice in the unified command, some of the information from the unified command didn't necessarily make its way to the utilities. And from our perspective, there was a lot of emphasis, and rightfully so, on identifying the responsible party, but not necessarily trying to stop the source when it was hard to find out exactly where it was coming from. Next slide, please. So addressing some of the challenges was seen as something of a priority from the water utilities, and we were pleased that COG was able to make this happen and sponsor an after-action conference to help with this effort. Next slide, please. So this is generally a list of sampling that is available to utilities, and this is somewhat of a regional list focused on responding to a spill event. The HOC sensors that are part of the regional monitoring network are available. There's 7 sensors on the raw water side, additional ones on the finished water side. Online sampling capabilities include the TOC analyzer at raw water pump stations. 2 biological monitors are available on the plant to evaluate plant toxicity, the fish biomonitors to see how fish respond. We've got an oil and water sensor. Also, some laboratory sampling capabilities. So what's listed here are some of the various tests that could be used to narrow down what the turbine oil or another contaminant, if it were, in the river was. So some of these we did during the event. Some of these are available for in the event of an unknown contaminant. Notable from the list, the air survey told us that it was a semi-volatile. We then did a liquid-liquid extraction and identified the contaminant as the C18 to C40 carbon chain. We performed odor monitoring continuously or at various points from the beginning of the event to the end. VOC is another test that's available that would be useful if it were, let's say, a gasoline or another type of more volatile hydrocarbon. The SVOC method 625 was performed during this event by WSSC. Method 608, the pesticides could be used if we suspected, say, a pesticide or that type of contaminant. And finally, I've got a list of other laboratory capabilities down there as a bullet. You know, there are other labs in the region with specialized capability, and that's one thing that we were able to quickly pull together the list of those types of capabilities. Next slide, please. So graphically illustrated, the objective of the after action was to take situation reports that were produced and the online information that was posted to the online reporting tool through the ICPRB and produce an after-action report, so that we essentially a written hot wash after the event to give us an actionable and correctable item from which we can improve upon. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to step through the next 3 slides fairly quickly. As Greg mentioned, we were able, at the end of all of this, to pull together an formal after-action conference in March, and had 62 people come from a variety of agencies. You can see there a pretty full room. It was hosted here at Fairfax Water. I'll just give a couple folks some credit. You see Charlie Fitzsimmons there in the front. He and EPA were very helpful, not only during the response, but in organizing the after-action. Also, the folks from NRG, they provided funding for the contractor, Horsley Witten, that facilitated the event and helped us produce our improvement plan and after-action report. So it was a good team effort, lots of involvement from a lot of different agencies. You can move on to the next slide, please. So I wanted to jump right into what were some of the things that we hit upon as needed action and improvement. One is a geographic response plan for the non-tidal Potomac River. We've been able to work with Colonial Pipeline Company and get a tactical response plan in place for the portion of the river that's downstream for their pipeline, but that doesn't cover a big part of the area that was affected by this spill or upstream of even where this spill would be. So we're happy to report actually that EPA has already committed to make this happen with one of their contractors, and so I believe they've already started reaching out to folks, and that's going to happen. It's probably the most important outcome from the after action is having a good geographic response plan so you know what to do, and it's well planned out and exercised in advance. Verifying spill notification and time of travel reporting, you heard that went really well, and we want to make sure that it continues to go well by verifying we have all the right people in the chain for reporting those pieces of information. Lab identification. You saw Greg show some of the capabilities of our utility labs. There certainly are times, though, when either because of the number of samples, volume of samples, or what you're looking for, the water utility lab may not be the best place to send it. So we have a group working now following this after action to confirm and build out our list of regional labs where we can send samples during events like this. And then building relationships through exercises and training. Greg mentioned earlier the number of spill exercises we've done. They've been invaluable not only in building up relationships among utilities and among the primacy agencies and EPA, but also including folks like Colonial Pipeline Company, Norfolk Southern, and other upstream entities that are infrastructure owners, have the potential to spill something in the river, and we need to have good relationships with them in advance before an event occurs. Next slide, please. Last few things, improving coordination between utilities and local emergency management. You know, I think a comment was made at the After Action conference by one of the local fire departments who shall remain nameless. Hey, if you needed our support, you could have, something along the lines of, you could have called 911. Obviously, you don't want to be in a spill event and having to do that. So I think one important thing is making sure if you're a utility, if you're a local emergency management agency, or a state primacy agency, making sure you have good relationships with the utilities, with your emergency management agency, and so forth ahead of time, so that when a spill event occurs, there's good interaction and mutual support in responding to the spill, again, rather than meeting people at the time of the spill and trying to get them to help you out. You see there's spill detection response capability. Greg mentioned some of the monitoring that we do that was actually very effective in this event in making us confident that we didn't have problems and could safely use the water in some instances, or if there was the presence of something where there was a presence of it. And we're evaluating now some new technologies we may be deploying going forward to improve that capability. So there's a work group working on that. It was very important in this event. And then improved capability to sample for and identify an unknown, which was a problem here. Part of the delay in responding effectively or more effectively was not knowing what the substance was that had been spilled. So things that can be done in terms of lab capability, whether it's at the utilities themselves or partnering with other labs, like one lab we're working with now is the DC Forensics Lab, and developing an MOU with them so that we have a better capability to analyze for unknown contaminants. And the last thing, long-term water outage planning. We've been working on that now for the last 2 years with our local emergency management agencies and the utilities to make sure there's good understanding on roles, responsibilities between the utility, emergency management, and who would do what in the event there was a long-term outage in terms of providing alternative water supplies to customers. And we're going to continue that dialogue this July. We have another meeting planned. So if that's something you haven't worked on, would certainly encourage it, because it can be a daunting problem if you're trying to provide alternative supplies of water to hundreds of thousands of people for a prolonged period of time. So next slide, please.
Okay, so real quickly, some of the other activities that are going on. It just happened that even prior to the event, the Water Quality Work Group of our Drinking Water Source Protection Partnership had been working on a regional utility response framework, flow chart, sampling plan, protocols, even having spill response chain of custody forms in place. We mentioned the ICPRB website secure portal for communications that replaced an earlier email communications that have been in place for many years. An important part of source water protection is getting familiar with the facilities upstream of your intake and working to ensure timely communications. That's also part of this. We now have a much stronger relationship with this facility as a result of this event. Next slide, please. So other source water protection opportunities is leveraging the Clean Water Act programs. So many of you are familiar with NPDES permits. States and other entities, through public renewal process, when permits are updated, can request that certain downstream entities, such as public water supply, be provided with timely notification as a requirement of a VPDS discharge. Also, the NPDES permit applications and permit renewal process can be evaluated to see what chemicals or processes might be of interest for downstream public water supply protection. On a longer-term basis, for constituents that may be more chronic type of issues, the water quality standards for public water supply designated waters could also be a tool. Also, there could be other state, federal, local regulatory programs. Some that come to mind are the SARA Title III Tier 2 chemical storage reporting requirements. Another is the dry weather screening that is required under many MS4 permits. Finally, there's options to reduce intake concentrations through physical measures. While not really source water protection, they are measures that could be used to reduce the concentration. For instance, you could install a submerged intake, or a slide gate or other physical baffle could be used to help protect your intake. Next slide, please. In both the Occoquan and Fairfax Water's Occoquan and Potomac basins, we've had past spills that we've had an opportunity to learn from. In the case of a pipeline operator, we've had two major events that have occurred in the past. And as a result of these events, we've been able to engage the pipeline operator and their regulator in proactive and more transparent in their operations. We've been able to view their pipeline monitoring information. We've been able to get them to develop tactical response plans specific for our region and share with us. We've conducted several tabletop exercises with them. There's ways of learning, again, getting to know the facilities and developing these and best of all, we have a relationship with these with this operator and with these facilities that we can now build upon in the event that there were another spill. Next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to mention that WaterSuite is a tool. It's a software platform for source water protection efforts and more. It's a cloud-based software platform that allows for timely decision-making process, and this is what we're essentially utilizing. Essentially, more than just a GIS, kind of a real information can be stored and accessed in this. And I don't. In the event of time, I'm not going to spend too much time on WaterSuite to do it justice. There are other presentations out there on the WaterSuite tool, but this is something that our region is looking at as a way to serve as a real-time information tool for source water protection, and would certainly come in the event of spill response. Next slide, please. More specifically, there are a number of spill response capabilities in WaterSuite, including the ability to investigate your facilities upstream, identify contaminants by name or characteristic. This could be very, if you've got an idea, if you've got a particular smell of a chemical, this can be very powerful. And you can also produce information to help in the event of working with the first responders, working with folks on the ground, and generate information and share that information across agencies and departments. Next slide, please. With that, we've got a few minutes for questions, so we'd be happy to answer. Steve and I would be happy to answer any questions that may be out there. Alan? Okay,
Greg. So yeah, please type your questions into the webinar control panel. We've already had a few get teed up during the presentation. And again, thanks for the, can we go back up to the questions? So let's start off with a question from Elizabeth. When were the utilities notified that the spill was petroleum product of unknown origin? Since it was known early the petroleum product, did utilities consider the contaminant unknown because the source was unknown?
So this is Steve. I'll just say that as you saw earlier, the Spill Response National Response Center sent out a notification on Sunday morning, and our utilities by noon were aware that there was a spill. And both from reports such as that, and as I mentioned, from a couple of our utilities actually going out on scene and observing what was there, we knew it was some kind of a floatable petroleum product creating a sheen on the river. What we weren't sure of was what was it exactly. As you might guess, there's all different types of petroleum products, and sometimes in terms of determining treatability and or the source of the spill, it's helpful to know exactly what is it, and that's what was unknown, is exactly what kind of product was it, other than that it was a petroleum product light enough that it was floating on the surface.
And Steve, that was the primary visual confirmation, was the fact that it was floating as opposed to being distributed through the water column. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks for the clarification there, Steve. Let's go to the next question from Jennifer. Would it be an option for utilities to share best practices and plan templates for emergency response through the Source Water Collaborative? And maybe I can start, Steve, you can ask the question, does COG do that for the utilities in the metropolitan DC region? Do they, physically sit down and share products, or how does that work in the DC region? Then we talk a little bit about the collaborative.
Yeah, so I guess I would answer that. My short answer would be yes. A good example of that would be, Greg mentioned some of the tabletops we've done. We actually did a very large scale one, I guess about 2 years ago now, that Colonial Pipeline sponsored to exercise the tactical plans Greg referred to. And as part of that exercise, we had everybody that participated physically bring their response plans to the exercise. And so that wasn't only response plans that water utilities might have, but the local fire department, the emergency management agency, the Coast Guard, the EPA, the company that, the pipeline operator and so forth, so we could get some idea of both differences and commonalities among the different response plans. And we try to do that among utilities too, to the extent we can, so you have some sense of, what kinds of actions do you call for and the timing of them in your plans. And exercises are a good way to bring about, best practices along those lines in terms of ways that folks do things the same or differently.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, I think that I like the idea of having people in a room to share the resources and talk to each other. Sometimes it's hard to download somebody's template from a website and then think about how to translate it to your own specific utility. So I think that the collaborative might be one option to collect some of these resources. And I might want to think about myself talking to some of my former colleagues at the American Water Works Association, because they were the ones that started the WARN networks. The NCR WARN plus other WARNs across the country have done a good job on focusing a lot of resources on preparedness and response. And so maybe through the WARN website, that might be another alternative to share some of these best practices or templates for preparedness. So something to think about between the collaborative and the National WARN webpage. So I want to move now to a question from Nancy, and it's similar to one that Lila had put up, is what type of time of travel model was used when you're trying to determine the time of travel, let's say between, Leesburg and Fairfax? Do you know the computer software that was used, Steve?
Well, I'll take that one. I mean, the ICPRB has for many years had a time of travel model. I think the early versions, I don't want to certainly speak on their behalf, but I think there's more information out there from the ICPRB. But I think the early models were based on USGS dye studies that were done years ago. And over the years, they've updated and refined that model. I know we had compared the results from some other general nationwide programs of time of travel estimates over the years. And I think, from everything we've seen, we've had the opportunity to run this from various events. I don't think there's been anything from the events that's necessarily contradicted any of the travel times that ICPRB has come up with. So everything has been specific to the region based on those original studies that were done. Now, WaterSuite has a general time of travel tool built into it, and from our perspective, there's ways in which it calculates that based on formulas for length and elevation and that type of thing. That serves as a good check, if you will, can serve as a good check to the ICPRB model that's been in place for many years. But any more questions about that, I'd probably defer to Carlton Haywood and the folks at ICPRB and probably be happy to answer more questions about that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll add.
Go ahead.
Several years ago, we did get some grant money back in the mid-2000s to collect some additional time of travel data, and also to get a copy of a model called River Spill, which is something that the Forest Service and some others had developed along with what used to be SAIC. Now they're part of Leidos, but in any case, so I believe ICPRB has that capability too. But I'll add one other thing, which is in addition to the modeling, which was incredibly helpful, what really made it even more powerful was being able to match it with on-scene observations from our utilities, because that gives you some real-time verification of the model estimate is saying it's going to be here at 6 o'clock, but I'm seeing it at 5 o'clock, or I'm not seeing it yet, right? So because models have a lot of assumptions built into them, and depending on the flow in the river and so forth, it can really skew the travel times one way or another. So pairing it with the ability to have folks get out in the field was really, really helpful.
Yeah, that was one question, is that I guess over time, the question was how accurate was the model used in notifying the utilities. It sounds like over time, it's probably been upgraded and improved, so it probably was generally pretty accurate during this one incident. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's pretty conservative in terms of, estimating the travel time, so you have enough lead time to take an action. But having the good field data on actual time of travel data under varying flow conditions really makes the difference for that.
Yeah, and then Fairfax Water is also a little bit lucky and a little unique in that the superintendent of the Corvallis Treatment Plant, Doug, rides his kayak across the river every morning, so that provides a visual. They just had an article about this in the AWWA Connections in the last week or two, and so I think that's a kind of an interesting, unique commute that he has. But he says not only does it help him mentally prepare or decompress from work, but also provides, you know, that early morning insight into what the source water looks like before he runs to the treatment plant that day. So Ashley has what I would call the $64,000 question, which is, why were water utilities not included originally in the incident command structure?
So I'll hazard a guess at that one. So some folks may be familiar with the geographic response framework that the Coast Guard and EPA uses. I think pretty much nationally a similar framework. And so typically under the framework they use for spill events, and keep in mind that a lot of times this is geared toward, you know, a major oil spill, you know, so think Deepwater Horizon is an extreme example, but I mean, you know, a significant oil spill. The Unified Command typically under those geographic response plans would be the federal government, so EPA, the Coast Guard, depending on where the spill happens and whose area of responsibility it is, the state environmental agency, or in this case on the Potomac, it was multiple agencies because it's a multi-jurisdictional body of water. And then when you identify who it is, the responsible party, and generally speaking, those are the decision makers that comprise the Unified Command. And then as you build out your ICS structure, you know, the notion is you fill in other subject matter experts in other parts of the command structure. You know, our observation was that that's one way to go about it, but I will say there have been some legitimate professional disagreements when we talk to our local emergency managers, folks that are with the local fire department or with FEMA, about is that the best way to do it, or should other folks be included within the Unified Command itself, depending on the nature of the event, and in particular, the consequences of the event. So in this case, if the major consequence is an impact to the region's water supply, doesn't it make sense to have water suppliers, at least, some representative of the water suppliers, included in the unified command? And so that's something we're hoping to address through the geographic response plan that we're developing now, is getting some clarity around, for this kind of an event, should it happen again, what is the ICS structure going to look like? The incident command system structure going to look like? And depending on the nature of the event, what does that mean for the members of the unified command? So there's multiple ways that we could go about addressing that problem. But what it gets down to is whether you're in the unified command or you aren't, having the appropriate lines of communication so you're getting information quickly and then can take an action on it, and that information is getting back to the unified command members too, so they can take action. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and I appreciate your thoughtful response. If somebody had asked me that question maybe when I wasn't moderating the webinar, my response might not be as politically correct as yours. So again, appreciate the thoughtful response. I think it'll work out in the long run. I just know, speaking personally, it was a little bit frustrating to hear about that lack of inclusion in a pretty critical role. So let's move on to a question from Steve, who wants to ask you too, are you using WaterSuite to manage and display data from your source water monitoring system?
Not yet.
Is that something you may think you're considering or just thinking about for the future, possibly, Greg?
It has that capability, so that could potentially be future integration.
Yeah, I would characterize it as taking a crawl, walk, run approach, and the crawl part being updating the source water assessment for all the utilities in the Metro Washington region, and using WaterSuite as the tool to do that, so that we have good visibility on potential upstream threats and can begin assessing those and then reaching out as appropriate to contact folks we need to contact, including the emergency management agencies, and getting Tier 2 data and all that. And I think the feeling kind of was, once we're pretty solid on getting our arms around all that information and beginning to use it, that we could then look at going to kind of some other, utilizing other capabilities that WaterSuite has. But I can tell you, and I see Greg nodding his head, it's been a lot just to get the updated source water information in there, good fidelity on potential threats upstream, and then beginning to reach out to some of those, higher priority folks that we would like to bring in as partners and begin planning with them. So I think the monitoring will be down the road a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, I think that I really like that crawl, walk, run analogy, because it kind of gives the idea, and some idea, you need to kind of generally know where you're going, where you're crawling, but you don't have to be exactly on point. You can also use that to evolve your direction slightly and adjust as your knowledge becomes more improved, which is what you're talking about doing with the updated source water assessments. So we have one last question for Samantha. I think it's a pretty easy one. How have you been able to incorporate non-point source contamination such as nitrate into planning on the Potomac River?
Well, that's an interesting question. Part of why the partnership was founded was to try to bring a voice to and a framework to the source water protection arena for things like nutrients that have been of interest to the Chesapeake Bay program and interest to local governments and other watershed protection efforts that are going on. So I think the Potomac Basin being over 10,000 square miles upstream of the Metro DC intakes, we hope to make more efforts with non-point source protection and utilizing things like WaterSuite to do that. We've had various work groups. We had an agriculture work group, did some successful work with cryptosporidium source tracking years ago. on the non-point source side, but you know, we're going to, again, part of the crawl, walk, run, you know, starting with the things that pose the acute hazards first, and then see how we fit within the framework of the more chronic water quality issues.
Thanks, Greg. That's again, like you said, it's a big watershed. It'll take some time to tackle, but I think it sounds like that it's being thought about as part of the planning process. So let me get to the next slide, and I've just got a couple of personal observations I want to pass on as being a resident of the DC area, and then also a board member at Fairfax Water. So, you know, clearly from the presentation that Steve and Greg did, getting prepared and responding to region can be complicated. And there are a lot of other, you know, trying to step away a little bit from DC, that a lot of major areas, you can look at Atlanta, you can look at Dallas, you can look at Chicago, you can look at Los Angeles. You know, you've got multiple water systems in multiple jurisdictions, so that complicates the preparedness and response. Here in the DC area, we're fortunate to have COG play a leadership role for the region, particularly in water. There are these regional council governments across the country. A lot of them focus a little more on land use planning or transportation issues or economic development, population growth. And so the fact that COG has played such a leadership role in water security preparedness has really been a blessing. Because from my opinion, the outcome for the region from the SHEEM could have been a lot different. If you go back to one of Greg and Steve's slides, that after 24 hours, we start seeing loss of water service. And, you know, even with all the prior preparation, we still had issues with communications and response. And again, just given a personal perspective, my son, Michael, lives in Georgetown, so he's served by the Washington Aqueduct. When I found out about this Monday, and I found about it on Monday from Twitter, because I had been a bad board member and not been checking my emails from Fairfax Water, you know, I sent a text to my son saying, hey, buy some bottled water. You may have a problem with water service in the DC area, because I wasn't sure how this whole SHEEM was going to play out. Given that Monday afternoon. So again, from a personal perspective, it could have been a lot different had it been, you know, 48-hour outage or 72 or 96. And so again, I think that you can see from what both Greg and Steve talked about, that both source water monitoring and protection can play critical roles in being prepared and responding. So let's go to my last slide here. Again, we've got another one of these webinars in fall that's going to focus on agricultural land conservation. From today's discussion, you can go to the Fairfax Water website, you can go to the COG website, or you can go to the Potomac River Partnership website. So again, I'd like to thank Greg and Steve for taking the time today and providing some really excellent details and some great information about the spill, and then sort of the after action and lessons learned. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for participating today. We had a nice turnout for the webinar, and let's keep the water safe. Bye.